My husband left me for a younger woman, but I made sure he lost everything. Emily Walker had spent years believing in the life she built with Mark. Their marriage, once filled with love and passion, had evolved into something steady and predictable. She had sacrificed so much, her career, her dreams, her independence, all to support his ambitions, to be the rock that held their family together. Friends envied her, admired the beautiful home, the luxury, the stability, but they didn't see the quiet doubts creeping into her mind. Mark had always been ambitious, always striving for more, and somewhere along the way, she began to wonder if he still saw her the way he once did. The longing glances were gone, the warmth in his voice had faded, but she told herself it was just the natural course of marriage. After all, they had history. They had love, didn't they? Then came the shift. It started small, text messages late at night, the sudden need to stay at work longer, the way he seemed to avoid her gaze when he spoke. At first, she convinced herself she was imagining things. Mark was just busy. Work was stressful. They were both exhausted, but the distance between them grew like an unspoken wall. Conversations became strained, reduced to curt exchanges about dinner plans and schedules. She reached for his hand at night, only to find the space beside her empty more often than not. The excuses were always the same: late meetings, work emergencies, the demands of a man in high places. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. So she buried her instincts, ignoring the way her heart clenched every time he dismissed her concerns with a distracted nod. The truth revealed itself in the cruelest way possible. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, not at first. It was a slow unraveling, a series of tiny, damning details that Emily could no longer ignore. A hotel receipt, crumpled and forgotten in his jacket pocket. A faint smudge of lipstick on his collar. Not her shade. And then the text message that shattered any illusion she had left. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen, her heart pounding so hard it made her feel sick. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. She had spent months doubting herself, questioning her own judgment, when the truth had been staring her in the face all along. Mark wasn't just distant. He was gone. When she confronted him that evening, she expected anger, guilt, even shame. But there was none of that. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He simply looked at her with cold indifference and said the words that would haunt her forever. "I'm in love with someone else." The floor seemed to shift beneath her. The air sucked from her lungs as the weight of his confession settled in. He was leaving, just like that. No second chances, no remorse, just the cold, hard truth. He had moved on, and she was nothing more than a remnant of the life he no longer wanted. And then, the final blow. Her replacement had a name: Sophie. 26, breathtakingly beautiful, a model who made him feel young, exciting, alive. He said it so casually, as if explaining a business transaction, as if their years together were nothing more than an outdated contract ready to be tossed aside. Emily barely recognized the man standing in front of her. This wasn't the husband she had built a life with. This was someone ruthless, calculated, already looking ahead to a future that didn't include her. And he had prepared for this moment well. The divorce papers were already drawn up, a cold and clinical process ensuring she walked away with as little as possible. The house, the accounts, the assets, everything had been arranged in his favor. And as if that weren't enough, he expected her to leave immediately. Emily sat in the quiet emptiness of her new apartment, the reality of her downfall settling like a crushing weight on her chest. In a matter of days, she had lost everything: her husband, her home, her security. The legal system, skewed in Mark's favor, ensured that she walked away with nothing but the bare minimum. The walls around her felt suffocatingly small, a sharp contrast to the sprawling estate she once called home. She curled up on a mattress that lay on the floor, a single suitcase by her side, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to break. Sobs racked her body, grief and humiliation pouring out in waves, because she had given everything to a man who discarded her without a second thought. She was nothing to him now, disposable. forgettable. But in the quiet stillness of that dark room, something stirred within her. A flicker of something stronger than pain, deeper than betrayal. A fire, long buried, but never fully extinguished. She had lost everything, but she wouldn't stay lost. Mark may have walked away without looking back, but he had underestimated the woman he left behind. He thought he had won. He thought she was finished. He was wrong. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Emily's life. Every morning, she woke up to the harsh reality of her situation, alone, abandoned, and stripped of everything she had worked for. The pain was relentless, a dull ache that settled deep in her chest. But beneath the sorrow, something else began to take root. Anger. Not the kind that burned out quickly, but the kind that smoldered, growing stronger with each passing day. Mark had taken everything from her, but he had not taken her will to fight. At first, survival was her only focus. With little savings and no job, she had to figure out a way to support herself. The woman who once managed household expenses and social events with ease now found herself searching for a foothold in a world she had put aside for too long. She had given up her career to support Mark, and now she had to start over from nothing. But if there was one thing she had learned from years of standing in her husband's shadow, it was how the game was played. She wasn't just a housewife. She had been the woman behind a powerful man, the one who had helped polish his image, manage his affairs, and keep his world running smoothly. She knew his weaknesses, his blind spots, and she was going to use them. The first step was finding a way back into the professional world. Emily had a degree in finance, a skill set that had gathered dust over the years, but it wasn't useless. She started small, picking up consulting work, offering financial planning advice to other women who had found themselves in similar situations. Slowly but surely, she regained her confidence. Each client, each small success, was a reminder that she wasn't weak. She wasn't just Mark's discarded wife. She was Emily Walker, and she was capable of rebuilding herself from the ground up. But the more she rebuilt, the more something became clear. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to make sure Mark paid for what he did. She hadn't forgotten the way he tossed her aside like yesterday's news, the cruel words he had used to break her down. Predictable. Old. Boring. He had underestimated her. He thought she would disappear quietly, that she would be too broken to fight back. He was wrong. One evening, as she sorted through old files, she found something interesting. Documents, contracts, vague transactions that Mark had once kept hidden from her. But Emily had always been good with numbers, and the more she studied them, the more she recognized something familiar. Fraud. Mark had been playing dirty for years, shifting money into offshore accounts, dodging taxes, and covering his tracks well enough to keep the authorities from looking too closely. But he had forgotten one thing. Emily knew him better than anyone. She could have gone straight to the police, but that wasn't satisfying enough. No, she wanted to destroy him the way he destroyed her. So, she started watching, waiting, gathering information. She kept her distance, but she listened. People still spoke freely around her, underestimating her presence. She heard whispers about Mark's business dealings, the way he flaunted his success with Sophie on his arm. He thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. As she watched from the shadows, something became painfully clear. Sophie wasn't just some beautiful young model. She had secrets of her own. Emily dug deeper, and what she found made her smile for the first time in months. Mark's perfect new woman had a past, one linked to financial scandals and fraud cases in another city. Mark, blinded by his own arrogance and infatuation, hadn't bothered to vet her the way he vetted his business partners. He had walked right into a trap, and he didn't even know it yet. Emily had always believed that karma would do the work for her, but now she realized she was karma. The first night in her tiny apartment felt suffocating. The silence pressed down on Emily like a weight, reminding her that she was truly alone. The luxurious home, the expensive clothes, the life of comfort, all gone. But as she stared at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Herself. Not Mark's wife. Not the perfect homemaker. Just Emily. And for the first time since her world fell apart, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt like she was awakening. She refused to be another broken woman discarded by a rich man. Mark had taken everything, but she still had one thing left: her mind. She had spent years managing finances, helping Mark organize investments, handling tax documents. She wasn't just a wife. She had been the backbone of his success. And if she had built him up, she could build herself back too. The first step was survival. She reached out to old colleagues, former acquaintances, people who still remembered her sharp mind and expertise. It started small, consulting gigs, financial planning for small businesses. But with each success, she regained a piece of herself. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't weak. With each paycheck, she rebuilt her confidence. The Emily who had once been content to live in Mark's shadow no longer existed. This Emily was hungry, determined, unstoppable. And soon, she wanted more than just survival. She wanted justice. It started with a memory, a fleeting thought she couldn't shake. Mark had always been careful about finances, too careful. He had documents she wasn't allowed to touch, bank accounts he never discussed. A suspicion took root in her mind, growing stronger with every piece of financial history she reviewed. Late at night, she pored over old statements, searching for inconsistencies, following the money trail that Mark had tried to bury. And then she found it. Offshore accounts, hidden assets, fraud. Her hands trembled as she pieced it together. Mark wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a criminal. A part of her wanted to go straight to the authorities, to watch them tear down everything he built. But that would be too easy. No, she wanted him to feel powerless, the way he had made her feel. She wanted to strip him of everything, slowly, methodically, until he had nothing left. She couldn't do it alone. She needed information, access. She needed to get closer to his world. So she did. She played the game better than he ever could. She charmed her way into conversations with his business associates, reconnected with old mutual friends, all under the guise of being the gracious, forgiving ex-wife. People talked, and Emily listened. Every careless word, every seemingly unimportant detail, it all became ammunition. And then she found her greatest weapon, Sophie. Sophie wasn't just a young model with a pretty face. She was a fraud, a woman with a history of financial scandals, one who had left a trail of deception in her past. Emily smiled when she realized the irony. Mark had left her for someone who would ruin him faster than she ever could. And he was too arrogant, too blinded by lust, to see the truth. She could have warned him. She could have let him know the kind of woman he had welcomed into his bed. But why would she do that? Emily had always been patient. She had spent years waiting for Mark to notice her, to appreciate her, to love her the way he once did. That patience was now his undoing. With every piece of information she gathered, she crafted the perfect plan. It started with an anonymous tip, just a whisper to the right journalist, a breadcrumb of evidence left in the right inbox. Mark had spent years building his empire, weaving a web of deceit and corruption. But no empire could stand when its foundation was rotting. The moment the first article dropped, the walls began to crumble. Financial regulators launched an investigation. Stocks plummeted overnight. Investors panicked, pulling out faster than Mark could stop them. The media painted him as a fraud, a man who had built his fortune on lies. His business partners, once loyal, once unwavering, turned their backs on him. Lawsuits flooded in, and for the first time in his life, Mark Walker wasn't the predator. He was the prey. And Emily? She watched from the sidelines, unseen, untouched, victorious. But the greatest blow wasn't the financial ruin. It wasn't the loss of his company, his reputation, or his wealth. No, the final betrayal came from Sophie. Emily had known it would happen. She had counted on it. Sophie had never loved Mark. She had loved the power, the luxury, the status. But when the money dried up, when the media vilified him, when the invitations to exclusive parties stopped coming, so did she. Mark came home one evening to find their penthouse half empty. Sophie had taken everything she could carry. Jewelry, designer clothes, expensive watches, all gone. The only thing she left behind was a short note. I can't do this. I deserve better. Emily could almost hear the moment Mark finally understood. The man who had once stood above her, who had humiliated her, discarded her, made her feel small and unworthy, was now alone. Everything he had stolen from Emily, his wealth, his status, his illusion of control, was gone. And Emily? She was free. For the first time in years, she didn't think about Mark with anger or pain. She thought about herself, about her future. She had taken back everything he tried to strip from her. Her power, her confidence, her life. She had won. And Mark? Mark had lost everything. And she hadn't even needed to lift a finger. He did it to himself. Mark had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that no matter what he did, no matter who he hurt, he would always land on his feet. But as his empire crumbled around him, as his name became synonymous with fraud and deception, he learned the harshest truth of all. No one was invincible. Emily knew the timing was perfect. She had waited, bided her time, and now, when Mark was at his weakest, she struck with precision. With his company in ruins and his finances in disarray, she petitioned the court to reopen their divorce settlement. His lawyers, once sharks eager to rip her apart, were now scrambling to keep their sinking client afloat. But there was no saving him. The courtroom was nothing like before. The first time, she had been broken, blindsided, forced to accept whatever scraps Mark had tossed her way. This time, she was in control. The legal team that once fought against her now had nothing to shield him with. The evidence was clear. Mark had hidden assets during their divorce, funneled money into offshore accounts, and manipulated the system to cheat her out of what was rightfully hers. Now, the system turned against him. The judge's ruling was swift. Emily was awarded a larger share of Mark's remaining assets, his dwindling wealth cut down even further. The very money he had stolen from her, the fortune he had built on deceit, was now hers. And Mark was left with nothing. But his humiliation was far from over. The media tore into him like vultures, picking apart every scandal, every fraudulent deal, every lie. His name, once revered in business circles, became a cautionary tale. No company wanted to be associated with him. No investor wanted their name linked to his disgrace. His fall from grace wasn't just financial. It was social, professional, personal. He was officially ruined. And then, as expected, Sophie left. Emily had always known she would. Sophie had never been in love with Mark. She had been in love with his wealth. And with that wealth slipping through his fingers like sand, her devotion vanished just as easily. One day, she was by his side, whispering empty reassurances. The next, she was gone, off with a new man, one who could still afford to keep her in designer clothes and luxury vacations. Mark hadn't just lost his fortune. He had lost the illusion of love. Emily didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to watch him suffer. Mark had orchestrated his own destruction. All she had done was step aside and let it happen. But his suffering had only just begun. Mark's world collapsed around him piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His company gone, his reputation destroyed, his friends vanished. The luxurious lifestyle he had once flaunted now felt like a distant memory. No more private jets, no more high-profile parties, no more power. He sat alone in his nearly empty penthouse, staring at the unopened eviction notice on the table. This was his reality now. The empire he had built on arrogance and greed had crumbled, and no one was there to help him pick up the pieces. The same people who had once laughed at his jokes, shaken his hand in admiration, now refused to take his calls. He was a liability, a disgrace. But worst of all, he was alone. For the first time, he thought about Emily, not as the woman he had discarded, not as the wife he had betrayed, but as the person who had always stood by him. He had taken her for granted, convinced she would always be there, that he could move on without a second thought. Now he realized his greatest mistake. She had been the only real thing in his life, and he had thrown her away. So he reached out, desperate, hoping for some kind of redemption. When Emily saw his name on her phone screen, she wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for this moment, not because she wanted it, not because she needed validation, but because it was inevitable. She agreed to meet him, not out of sympathy, not out of lingering love, but to end this once and for all. When she arrived, she found him a shadow of the man he once was. His tailored suits had been replaced by cheap, off-the-rack clothing. His usual confidence, his arrogance, was gone. He looked like a man who had lost everything. And he had. His voice shook as he spoke, fumbling over his apologies. He admitted he had been wrong. He admitted he had taken her for granted, that he had ruined everything, that he regretted it all. His hands trembled as he reached for hers, desperate for some form of forgiveness. Emily just smiled, not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but out of knowing. He had done this to himself. And so, with a quiet, unwavering voice, she gave him the final truth. You already lost everything, and I didn't have to lift a finger. You did it to yourself. Then, without hesitation, she turned and walked away, never looking back. As Emily stepped out of the dimly lit cafe, a cool breeze brushed against her skin. The night was quiet, peaceful, nothing like the storm she had weathered over the past year. She inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. It was over. For the first time in a long time, she felt light, unburdened. There was no anger left, no bitterness. Just clarity. Mark was a chapter that had closed. He had written his own ending, and she had no desire to rewrite it for him. Once, she had loved him with everything she had. Once, she had built her world around him. But now, she was finally free. The city lights shimmered ahead, and with every step she took, she felt more certain of the woman she had become. She wasn't just the wife he had betrayed. She wasn't the woman he had discarded. She was something more. Stronger. Smarter. Untouchable. Back in his empty apartment, Mark sat frozen in his chair, staring at the spot where she had just stood. He had imagined this moment so many times, her taking him back, her giving him another chance. He had convinced himself that she still cared. But now he understood. She was done. Regret clawed at him, a suffocating weight that wouldn't lift. He had thought power and wealth made him untouchable. But in the end, he had been the fool. He had gambled everything on lust, arrogance, and greed. And he had lost. Emily never looked back. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about his downfall. It was about herself. As she hailed a cab, she smiled, a genuine, unshaken smile. She had won, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need anyone else to define what that meant.